Well, one of the questions people ask me all the time is there anything about Jonathan Edwards that you disagree with? It seems like you're a pretty earnest endorser of Edwards's thought, his preaching, his ideologies, his doctrines, and so forth. And for the most part, that is true. I would certainly classify myself as an Edwards admirer. That being said, though, that doesn't mean that there aren't certain areas that I would disagree with Jonathan Edwards, even sometimes disagree with him rather wholeheartedly. And in this video, what I'd like to do is to share with you a certain category of Edwards' thought that I really can't align myself with because I don't think it's good, I don't think it's right, and I don't think it's altogether helpful. So here we go. I'm going to disagree with Jonathan Edwards in relation to his Christian philosophy. Well, if you're new to this channel, what's up? My name is Matthew. I'm one of the pastors at Gospel Fellowship PCA. We are a Reformed Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh. If you're looking for a church like that, you found one, come check us out. Also, adjunct professor at RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh. I would love to have you in class at some point in the near future. All right. Before we get into Edwards's philosophy, which is an area of his obvious weirdness, I want to recommend a couple of things that are not so weird. First, I want to recommend my own book, A Theology of Joy, which is Jonathan Edwards's concept of happiness, especially as he roots that happiness in the doctrine of the Trinity. And then secondly, I want to mention this book right here, Holy Living, Jonathan Edwards' 70 Resolutions for Living the Christian Life. These would be two of my works on Jonathan Edwards that I think you might enjoy. Both of these are going to be pretty orthodox, pretty solid biblically, at least I hope they're solid biblically, and faithful expressions of Christianity, so I'd love for you to check those out. Okay, well, what I want to do is get into some of Edwards's weirdness, namely his philosophy, and to do that I'm going to share screen with you and get into why Edwards is so weird as it relates to his understanding of ontology. Now, let me just back up for just a second here and clarify that when we talk about philosophy as an academic enterprise, typically philosophy is broken down into three major categories. And let's just talk about those three categories because that's going to help us understand what Edwards is doing here. The first category is epistemology, which is essentially how we know anything. How is it that we learn? How is it that we understand? How is it that we know what we know? And typically, epistemologically, there are different ways that we can discern how it is that human beings can have true knowledge. For instance, there are those who are rationalists who would basically argue that much of what we know or can appreciate mentally comes through reason. And more particularly, we might even have something related to our senses. We know what we know because we can see, hear, touch, measure things, etc. Okay. Now, on the other hand, you have those who would be revelationists. Those would be people who believe that what we know can be discerned primarily through revelation, meaning God reveals himself to his creation through certain things, perhaps visions or dreams, but especially through inspired scripture. Now, obviously, Edwards would lean towards having that kind of mode of epistemology, that we know what true truth is because of Holy Scripture. And if Edwards is anything, he's certainly rigoristically biblical, which is definitely his attempt. Everything that I'm going to say, even in his areas of weirdness, I think he would say, if we could interview him, that he was trying to be faithful and biblical, even though the way he expresses certain things ends up being slightly awkward. And that brings us to the second category of philosophy, which is ontology or metaphysics. Now, metaphysics is the idea of what is reality. So it's not so much how we learn things, that's epistemology, but metaphysics or ontology tells us what is this world? Is this desk that I'm sitting at real? Can it disappear from reality in some ways? And this will be the area that I think Jonathan Edwards is primarily going to be very ill-fitted for otherwise orthodox, doctrinal, biblical, confessional Christianity. He's going to have some problems here. Then the third major category of philosophy is ethics, and that is, what does the holy life or the moral life look like? Or to express it in the way of the classical Greeks, what does the virtuous life look like? And there, of course, many of the Greek philosophers understood something like justice or courage or temperance as the moral life. Others pursued concepts related to happiness. Edwards is actually going to be in that sort of happiness category, which is why, again, going back to my book on happiness or joy, though he's going to differ from the hedonists in that he's not looking for some sort of experiential joy, the thrill of sex or wine, but rather the thrill of knowing God as Savior and Lord. So that would be his ethical system. Okay, so his weirdness is going to be found primarily in his ontology. So that being said, let's mention that one of the reasons we love Jonathan Edwards is because he's so interesting to study from various perspectives. Moreover, those perspectives would include his role as a pastor, as a revivalist, as a theologian, as a missionary. Some forget that he was a missionary. But then probably the least significant of these would be Edwards' work as a philosopher. And there's reasons why his philosophy is not very well known, and hopefully we're going to get into some of those reasons in this particular video. But I just want to let the cat out of the bag and tell you from my perspective the areas that Jonathan Edwards is reliable, and then I'm going to share with you some of my areas of strident disagreement with my dead mentor. First, Edwards is clearly conservative. Edwards is trying to preserve something, which is the nature of conservatism. What is he trying to preserve? Well, he's trying to preserve that Calvinistic Reformation era heritage that he would have inherited as something like a second or third generation colonial Calvinist. Okay, so Edwards is rooted historically between the Salem witch trials, which he was born after that, 1703. Those ended in 1692. And he's going to be before the Revolutionary War in America in 1776. He dies in 1758. Okay, so he's preserving writ large Calvinism as he has inherited it from the Puritans and from the Reformers. Okay, so much of his main writing is going to be in trying to defend what he perceives as traditional biblical Calvinism. I can also agree with him in these things, even insofar as he was congregational / Presbyterian. Now we say / Presbyterian, he was a congregational minister, but he probably would have endorsed a fully blown Presbyterianism in terms of his understanding of church polity. He's also confessional to a certain extent, though he's a little bit more of a biblicist than a truly confessional theologian, though he does say that he could subscribe to the Westminster Confession faith. Okay, so check. I'm in agreement with Edwards on all of those 4 areas. Where I'm in difference to Edwards then would be in his philosophy, and specifically that second category of philosophy, not his epistemology, because I too believe in divine revelation, not necessarily his ethics, because I too believe in a biblical ethic, but in his understanding of ontology, that is to say, what is. Now, when we enter into this discussion of Edwards' philosophy, I do have to tell you that within Edwards' scholarship, there is an internal civil war of how to understand Edwards in relation especially to his philosophy. Because the question is, what did Edwards himself actually believe? And in some sense, there's a tension here between the public Jonathan Edwards and the private Jonathan Edwards. And that tension is felt most acutely as it relates to his philosophical works. So let me describe the tension. There are some who would say, and I would put myself in this camp, that the truest Jonathan Edwards is the Edwards who published his writings. In other words, the guy who's preaching on Sunday, he's preaching what he believes. The guy who's putting out letters, treatises, major books, that's Edwards's refined ideology and his philosophy to the extent that he's ready to go public with it. And because I believe Edwards was primarily a very virtuous and moral man with high integrity, I do not believe that Edwards would intentionally deceive his audience, especially his congregation, and for those readers who were trying to understand his works. Moreover, the other viewpoint would be that the truest Edwards is the private Edwards, the Edwards that is in his private journals and notebooks, things that he did not intend for publication. Now, we're going to get to his philosophy here in just a minute, I promise. But this is where the great divide really is, because much of what Edwards wrote in his private notebooks about his philosophy, his ontology, his metaphysic, he did not preach and did not teach these things and did not publish these things. The only reason that we know that he held these things, or at least toyed with those ideas, is because he wrote about them in his private journals and notebooks. But here's the thing. Edwards is very much an experimental thinker, and he thinks with his pen. So as he's teasing out concepts in his mind, it's almost as though he's compelled to write them out by hand. That's how he thinks. And so as Edwards is dealing with some of these ideas that I'm going to share with you in a minute, I'm not fully convinced that he himself believed them, at least to the extent that he wrote them in his notebooks. And more to that same point, most of these philosophical concepts that have become so controversial come from the pen of the younger Jonathan Edwards, especially that 20-something, early 20-something Jonathan Edwards, whose mind is exploding with ideas as he's reading people from all over. He's reading Newton, he's reading Locke, he's reading natural philosophy. He's excited about these ideas, and so he's getting some of this on paper in his notebooks. And so I'm not convinced that the mature pastor, theologian Jonathan Edwards wouldn't have preached these things, especially as he knew that they probably wouldn't quite fit with that colonial Calvinistic conservative confessional atmosphere, the Sitzenleben in which Edwards was doing his ministry and carrying about his daily tasks and writings. Okay, so if we want to know Edwards' philosophical works, we have to go primarily to his private notebooks. And that would include the following. He's got a notebook on atoms where he talks about the structure of how reality is made. Now, most of us have a materialistic worldview in which we believe that this desk is made out of atoms, that this microphone is made out of atoms, that the sound waves that you're hearing and the light that's shining on my face, that these are all rooted in the very materialistic, tangible, natural world. Okay, Edwards is going to challenge that a little bit. His notebook of minds has to do with his conception of how God exists and how we exist as beings that can think and perceive and even feel. Edwards is going to be very interested in some of the natural world, including rainbows and lights and even spiders. He's very interested in the creation that God has made. But as he describes the creation and its relation to the Creator, he's going to do so in ways that defy the typical categories of Reformed theology. Now, I should tell you this too, just in case you're interested to know, that most of his writings are going to be contained in his scientific and philosophical writings, which is volume 6 of the works of Jonathan Edwards. Okay, so if you're interested in following up on what I'm going to say in this video, then definitely check out volume 6 of the official Yale collection of Edwards' works. Now, then let's get into two areas where Jonathan Edwards is definitely weird, and I would not advise that you follow him in his philosophical weirdness. The first, and I'm going to give you two, though there might be several others as well, is his concept of idealism. Now, idealism, the root word there is idea, and that's going to be central to understanding how Edwards perceives ontology or metaphysics or what exists, what is real around you. The basic idea in Jonathan Edwards' idealism, and this is a surprise to a lot of people when I teach this at the seminary, people are surprised that he believed this. But Edwards does not believe that the material world exists. I know that's a shock, and I'll say it again, but Edwards does not believe that the material world exists, at least in the same way that you and I believe that the material world exists, okay? So again, we think a tree is made out of molecules, which itself is made out of atoms, and that those things have some sort of physical one-to-one correspondence with reality. In other words, when I knock my hand on my desk, I'm assuming that both my fist really exists as a piece of matter, in fact, a composite of many molecules and many atoms. And I also likewise believe that the desk is real, that there's actually something there that I'm knocking on. This chair that I'm sitting on, I believe that it's going to hold me up because I believe that there's a real composite structure that is the chair sitting beneath me. But Edwards does not believe that. Edwards does not believe that matter is truly real, in the sense that what Edwards believes actually exists is really only one thing, and that is what Edwards will call mind. Now, mind is perception. Mind is living entity that has the capacity to perceive, to imagine, to believe, to will, and so forth. And so when Edwards thinks of mind, he does not start with my mind or your mind, even though we might do that, but rather Edwards starts with the idea of God's mind. God is the one true thing that absolutely certainly does exist. Edwards thinks that the idea of nothingness is an absolute contradiction, and that because nothingness cannot exist, then something must exist, and that thing that exists is God. So God is the fundamental starting point of all reality. In Edwards' viewpoint, there can be no such thing as reality that doesn't begin with the idea that God is, that God exists. But what is God? Is God a composition of atoms and molecules like we think that this desk is? No. Edwards believes that God is entirely spirit. Now, this is going to get complicated for him as it relates to the doctrine of the incarnation of Christ. And probably some of you can see where people are going to say, well, that's weird. And though you and I would probably agree that God, at least the Father, as God exists in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, in eternity past before the creation of the world, that God himself was not composed of atoms or molecules, rather that God is spirit. And as such, there is nothing that we could knock on God to touch him or to perceive him with the sense of the touch. And so if asked and pressed what God is, Edwards would say God is spirit. But more specifically, Edwards would like to classify the existence of God as mind. God thinks, God knows, God is, God wills, God perceives, God decrees. But all of these things are non-material in their essence. These are all comprehensions of the mind or the spirit of God. Now, how then does that relate to creation? Well, Edwards believes that what God made when he made the world is actually not material substance, but other minds, sub-minds, lesser minds. And that's where you and I come in. And that's where even animals come in, and perhaps even the vegetative world, though to a lesser extent than the animals, and certainly the animals to a lesser extent than humans. And perhaps we might even think of angels in that realm as well as existing in the mind. So what are you and I? What are we? We're essentially spiritual as well, in that we exist in the mind. Our minds exist within God's mind. God has called us, in a sense. He summoned us into existence with his mind. And so what we're bundles of perceptions in sort of Edwardian language. We are bundles of perceptions. I think I'm knocking on this desk because my hand feels it, but what's really happening is that my mind is perceiving other perceived resistance, okay? So for Edwards, all matter then is really perception. And what that means is that if we're to ask that ancient philosophical question, if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there to hear it, does it make a sound? Edwards' answer would be no. That tree has no isness. Only things that truly exist are things that are perceived, either by God or by the minds that God has made. So in some sense, it's kind of like the movie The Matrix, where reality isn't really real. The reality is that digital construct that people were perceiving. And Neo comes to understand this even as he realizes that the whole essence of reality is totally different than he perceived. And Edwards thinks the same thing is also true with us, that while the material world doesn't technically exist, for the most part, and for lack of a better term, it exists in as much as we perceive it to be real. So it doesn't matter that the desk isn't real. I perceive it to be real, and perception of resistance then is essence as far as Edwards goes. So why does he say something like this? Well, there's some philosophy that's kind of in the air in Edwards' time that he's certainly thinking through. First, Edwards is vehemently reacting against Thomas Hobbes's materialism. Now, Hobbes goes way too far in the other direction. Thomas Hobbes would say that the only real essence is matter. And for him, it'd be doubtful whether spirit or mind exists. For Thomas Hobbes, who you are is merely the collection of atoms in your brain and the synapses and the electrical impulses and so forth. But it would be debatable whether or not there's a spirit or a soul or a mind within you. You're just basically a construct of physical matter that believes it's alive and perhaps is in some sense, some limited sense, more so than a rock, but perhaps not really alive in that sort of a way. And so Edwards is going to react ardently against Thomas Hobbes's materialism by flying exactly to the other direction, wherein he aligns much more with the Anglican Bishop George Berkeley's concepts of idealism, who also was thinking about these things at about the same time as Jonathan Edwards. Now, Berkeley's writing on these things, and it would be easy to assume that Jonathan Edwards was reading Berkeley and got his idealism from Berkeley. The only problem there is that we can't seem to find that any of Berkeley's materials ever made it to Jonathan Edwards. He doesn't cite him. He doesn't quote him. We think he might have had some access to Berkeley's ideas somehow, but that establishment is not fully connected. So nevertheless, maybe Edwards developed these ideas on his own as he's thinking through some of the writers of his time, at least the writers that were extant and present to Edwards in his limited library that he would have had in the colonies. Okay. Now, the second idea that Edwards holds that, again, is very strange, especially to us more Orthodox Christians, is his idea of continuous creation. Now, here, this goes back to his idea of God and God's supernatural power over the world that God has made. Edwards would definitely say that God is sovereignly in charge of absolutely everything, and that every instant, every second, every creature, such as they are, depends fully upon God to even have its existence, much less motion or action or anything else. So because Edwards believes that all of creation is so intricately tied to God's providential sovereignty, Edwards holds that God is holding together the universe at every single second, holding it together by his power. So it's not like a deistic view where God made the world, set it spinning, and then just let it go, sort of the watchmaker concept. But Edwards believed that God is intimately in control, actively in control of not just some things, not just setting the laws of physics and nature into motion, but rather sustaining them at every single instant. And so for Edwards, what that means is that if God were to ever let go of the natural world, it would dissipate, okay? It wouldn't just continue to function like the clock functions after one winds it up, but rather the creation itself would disappear instantaneously. If God didn't sustain it moment by moment, instant by instant, second by second, then the whole of the universe would essentially dissipate and evaporate into nothingness. And again, nothingness isn't really real for Edwards. The mind of God is the essential reality in Edwards' worldview. So what does God do to sustain this world that he's made? Well, Edwards believed that God, in order to sustain it, creates it over and over again, every single second, every single iteration. Now, this is going to be problematic, of course, as it relates to the days of creation. And Edwards does still believe that the world was created in 6 days in some way. He thinks that those texts have integrity, linguistic and theological integrity. But really what God is doing, according to Edwards, is recreating the world second by second, instant by instant. And so every time history advances by even one iteration, that's essentially a new creation ex nihilo that God calls into existence and into being from the previous iteration, which is now dispersed. Okay. So in this way, it's like, remember when you used to draw those little flip books in a notebook and then you'd flip the pages and you'd see the little cat moving across the bottom of the page? It's a little bit what Edwards says reality is like. Or to make perhaps a more another illustration, it's kind of like the old stop action movies that they used to do before AI generated stuff and CGI and all that. The old King Kong movie back in 1933, when that claymation King Kong, you'd have to move its arm, then its leg, and then just move it slowly up the Empire State Building. Every scene had to be filmed like that. The way Edwards describes continuous creation is something very much like that, okay? So if we can summarize Edwards' philosophy in 10 aphorisms, God is the only real substance. So God is the only thing that really has fundamental existence. 2, existence is perception in the mind of God or the sub-minds that God made. Matter then is merely resistance within those perceptions. Matter itself is a mode of perception, he would say. Nothing exists that is not perceived. That's point number 5. God's non-existence is a logical contradiction. Now, I can definitely agree with that. I'm on board with that. Motion is the communication of resistance. The laws of nature are God's method to exercise his power, okay, not necessarily laws of gravity and so forth that God encodes into the system of creation itself. Intelligent beings, then, that's you and I, are the end of creation. In other words, why did God make anything? Well, so as to communicate his own essence to them, that the creatures would rejoice in him and be happy in salvation in the Lord. And then 10th, spirit is a series of perceptions. In other words, even the mind that is us, the spirit that is us, is rather that sort of iterated series of perceptions writ large over time. Okay. Now, there's some major concerns here, quite obviously. First, we have sort of a blurring of the creator-creation distinction. And that comes up because if God's mind, the mind of God, is the fundamental starting block of reality, and I don't disagree that it's fundamental, but as God calls minds into existence that exist within his mind, it does then tend to blur the distinction between the creator himself and the creation. That has led some people, including Charles Hodge, the Princetonian theologian, to critique Edwards as being something of a panentheist. Now, a pantheist basically means that all things are God. Pantheism, right? All things God. But panentheism, or that all things are in God, and that gets a little bit weak and squishy as well. Okay, so some have argued that Edwards is a panentheist, and we should be cautious about that. More to that same point, then it becomes harder to think of Edwards's ontology as being fully biblical, especially when we get into things like, for instance, what is the creation and how then is Christ incarnate as flesh. Okay, problem there. And this is going to lead Edwards to be at difference, I believe, with the Westminster Confession of Faith and some of the great standard creeds of Christendom. Okay, so that's going to be a problem. Now, if you want to do some further study on Edwards as a philosopher, you can hardly do better than Dr. Oliver Crisp's work. Crisp has done quite a bit of work on Edwards and ontology. These two books especially, Jonathan Edwards Among the Theologians by Oliver Crisp. I'm going to post a link in the description below, as well as to my books. And then Jonathan Edwards on God and Creation, where Crisp is going to definitely talk about Edwards' idealism, his continuous creation, and some other things like Edwards' occasionalism. Okay, so we didn't talk about that in this video, but it's in there. Now, a couple of cautions about Crisp. I think in my reading of Crisp that he makes too much of Edwards' private musings in his journals and too little of the public Edwards. And not only that, but let's just be honest. When a scholar or an academician or a professor discovers a particular area of thought, often they want to get as much bang for the buck as they possibly can in terms of publications, journal articles, lectures, courses, and so forth. It's my view that Crisp stretches these concepts so that the fabric practically tears in Jonathan Edwards. Crisp tends to take these things and make them central to Edwards rather than peripheral, as I believe them to be. Crisp takes these concepts and he makes them absolutely fundamental to Edwards' entire theological worldview and his theological project, where I would say that these are oddities that are mostly kind of the jottings and toyings that Edwards does in his notebooks when he's really thinking these sort of creative thoughts. In other words, Crisp and I disagree on that earlier debate, whereas I would hold that the real Edwards is the public Edwards. Crisp seems to think that it's the private Edwards. And so we would definitely disagree as colleagues on this particular matter. Okay? So what do we do with this? Well, you can either reject Edwards entirely on the premise that Edwards is weird and he doesn't seem to be then confessional in some sense, but I don't think rejecting Jonathan Edwards entirely is a good idea. What I would say we should do is reject Edwards partially, in as much as his idealism and his continuous creation get into some of his works. Those are the areas that we should be cautious. Whereas Edwards is generally a good exegete and a good theologian. Certainly he's Reformed and Calvinistic in most other areas. This just happens to be some of the oddities in which Edwards is not a reliable sage and guide for us. Okay? All right. So that's about it. And I just want to remind you, go ahead and get Crisp's book if you want to read Crisp on Edwards and ontology. If you want to read something more orthodox and doctrinally solid, again, my book on Edwards and Joy, or my book in Edwards' Resolutions, I don't think you're going to be steered wrong there. I certainly wrote them from an orthodox position myself. Okay. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for checking into this particular video. I do love you all lots. And we'll talk to you later.